The scripture story today is an old tale that comes to us out of the book of 1 Kings, a story that comes at the beginning of Solomon's career as king of Israel, as he was ascending the crown. It goes like this. 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. And then on the 3rd day, after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. And we were together, and there was no one else with us in the house, only the 2 of us were there. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him, and she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. And she laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born." But the other woman said, "No, the living son is mine, and the dead son is yours." The first said, "No, the dead son is yours, and the living son is mine." And so they argued before the king. Then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead,' while the other says, 'Not so, your son is dead, and my son is the living one.' So the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' And they brought him a sword. And the king said, 'Divide the living boy in 2, then give half to the one and half to the other.' But the woman, whose son was alive, said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, 'Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him.' And the other said, 'It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it.' Then the king responded, 'Give the first woman the living boy, and do not kill him. She is his mother.' And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice." Fascinating story. Well, one of the unforeseen benefits of this coronavirus quarantine, at least as I've experienced it, has been the effect that it's had on our extended family. For one thing, none of us have contracted the illness, as far as we know, and everybody on both sides has remained relatively well at home. And as a result, Wendy and I have been able to stay in touch with our daughters and their families, and as well as other relatives, far more frequently than our normal routines would allow. We're disappointed, of course, not to see our little grandsons, especially Clark, who was born at the end of February, but we've compensated by having several FaceTime calls each week. And I've also had longer conversations with my mother because, of course, nobody's going anywhere. And this inconvenient time made me appreciate what we've gained, despite the freedom that we've temporarily lost. Prior to the shutdown, our grandsons by now would have been in daycare or with babysitters while their parents went to work. And like most 2-income families, quality family time is much more limited than at present. In fact, none of our daughters enjoyed this extent of focused time with any of their parents growing up, but over the past couple of months, Emily and Jenny have been able to offer it to their young children. It's been a delight. And I think the long-term effects of this must be positive. With daily routines and schedules as they normally are, parenting has become a stressful responsibility with roles and commitments that are hard to juggle when both parents are devoting their best time and energy of each day to their workplace rather than to their home life. And doubtless our daughters are grateful and delighted for this time, recognizing the privilege this pandemic has afforded them, and knowing that it's less likely to be true for those with essential jobs or single-parent households. And so everybody counts their blessings. No one in our extended family takes any of this time for granted. Now, parent-child relationships, as we know, matter to us at every age and at every stage. As we journey through this sort of proverbial bell curve of life, we come to realize that the earliest years and the later years seem to parallel each other. Care for basic health and welfare is, of course, the primary concern and focus. The task of attending to one with limited capability and independence requires a significant amount of time and energy. And so as a mother or father of a young child, or as an adult taking care of an elderly parent, being a caregiver can be quite demanding, quite exhausting, though it's not work that is insignificant or even regrettable. I mean, yes, it's demanding upon the one providing care, but it usually is a sacrifice that one offers out of love, or at least duty, especially if the bonds are strained. And because parenting isn't that easy, it may not go very well, which tends to haunt a mother more than any other. A mother, it would seem, bears an unequaled emotional burden for her own, for those who were a part of her. And thus she often finds much of her own identity, self-esteem, purpose in life tied directly with the lives that she, by nature and by nurture, has borne. Now, with such a thought in mind, I'd like to turn to this story from 1 Kings that on the surface seems to be quite the opposite of what I've just said. But in the end, I think you'll find that it truly isn't. It's a tale most closely associated with the great wisdom of Solomon, a stunning example of his powers of discretion and discernment in determining the true mother of a living child. But at the same time, it's a tragic story. A tragic story, given the circumstances of the mothers who desperately needed their children for their own dignity and self-worth, and perhaps even a life to simply love. Now, these two women were not ordinary mothers, though at one time it's possible that they may have been. They are described in the text as prostitutes, women whose behavior and circumstances were uniformly rejected and reviled. Now, in biblical times, there was no reputable connotation one would make with prostitution. Rahab, the cunning innkeeper of Jericho, might be a rare exception. Though in many ancient cultures, prostitutes actually had a legitimate place in various temple cults, with a public standing not unlike our present-day professional sex workers. But generally speaking, prostitution is viewed as a rather inglorious employment, associated with sexual immorality, promiscuity, temptation, substance abuse perhaps, infidelity, adultery, and virtually every other pornographic behavior that we can imagine, even though I suppose the ones who really deserve greater scorn are those who actually purchased such services. But in terms of biblical righteousness, such a lifestyle epitomized the furthest state one could be from purity and innocence, let alone the noble role of motherhood. But as often is the case in life, the victim is the one being blamed. The victim is the one being blamed. The immoral reality of prostitution is not a cause necessarily, but rather a consequence. A consequence. Throughout history, the vast majority of those who turn to sex trafficking do so out of need, usually because of poverty or addiction, resorting to selling their bodies as a marketable commodity in order to support themselves. And within ancient Israel, those who did were either sex slaves who had been sold into prostitution by their parents because of poverty, a disturbing reality, mind you, that still exists with alarming frequency around this world. Or else they were women who had no other means of support, which was often true with single mothers or those who were widowed. And in most cases, it was a tragic social condition that reflected an insecure, often spiraling existence where a desperate woman could not otherwise survive, let alone find any dignity or worth. Now let's be clear, the storyteller doesn't want us to lose sight of this. Namely, that in their cruel and callous context, these women were not in a position to receive any measure of sympathy from within their society, and most were treated with utter disdain. And in fact, it was unheard of that they should be granted this privilege to come before this newly anointed king. And so the context to this story, in fact, is somewhat unusual. But because Solomon's wisdom reflected that of Yahweh, it was set up as a story to scale the least to the greatest, which may be why this tale of woe was so remarkable and why it was so memorable and why it's worth pondering. Now, as it is told, the unnamed antagonist was the mother who lost her child in the night by accidentally smothering it. Horrible circumstances, only to realize her terrible mistake and try to replace her deceased child with the other woman's baby. And you know that this is the sort of sordid drama that people might have expected to hear about in those gossip chains and devouring all that salacious news of the morally depraved underworld. Immoral people, of course, do the most shameless, despicable things. But with this harsh and condescending judgment aside, a more empathetic reading of the mother's predicament might recognize it could have been to merely save for herself the only pure and innocent relationship she knew, that being, of course, between a mother and a child. And likely her other relationships were soiled with shame or superficial, complicated, strained. Whereas this new, beautiful, and innocent child would only know her as a loving mother. It could have been a fresh start with someone who didn't already know her past, who didn't know her place in life, or the likely verbal or physical abuse she suffered given her trade, or what she had become and what she had to offer anyone in life. Desperation spawns all kinds of evil, doesn't it? Well, by this point in her life, any sense of family was likely lost, other than with this very precious, beloved son. She didn't intend to kill her baby. I mean, she wasn't being irresponsible here. She wasn't a criminal. When she realized what had happened, she was heartbroken. She was desperate. She was yearning for the life of her child. And desperate people do desperate things. Perhaps this woman's soul was crying out for a genuine, unconditional, uncomplicated, dignified relationship of pure love. Maybe this child was one thing she wanted to protect, something to be proud of. One mark she could leave behind in a world where she would likely leave no recognizable, let alone honorable footprint. And like many in this place, maybe she felt completely unlovable to all, but the one that she cared for with a mother's affection. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, we see that ourselves where crime rates are high and poverty of both body and spirit are widespread. People in these conditions, they're desperate, aren't they? They don't always choose to do wrong, as we sometimes assume they do. They don't aspire to have mounting heartache and pain. They are in dark places, friends. Dark places because life and its plethora of bad choices and bad decisions have brought them there. They are both a victim and a perpetrator of evil. In any case, Tragically or carelessly, this woman lost her child. She destroyed this one gift of love, this pure heart from her life. The sudden reality made her lose her mind, lose her conscience, perhaps even her soul for eternity. Unconscionably, she stole the other mother's son, quickly passed it off as her own. And that child, regardless of the circumstances surrounding its conception or where she stole it, that child was her gift from God. She selfishly clung to this little life as only a mother could, even when it wasn't hers to own. And only the devil or a sympathetic God could understand such craziness. It's inhuman. It's inhumane. Well, like other biblical stories, the tragedy didn't end there. This terrible act of maternal fraud absolutely tore the heart out of the living child's mother. Victimized people tend to victimize others, don't they? And maybe they were of similar circumstances. She, too, was a prostitute who likely lived her life of quiet desperation. And who was the better mother? Really, who was the better mother? Now she as well had lost her child. She had been brought down to the same mire of sadness and desperation. And making it worse was that her son was still alive, but stolen by the other. And she knew it. She wasn't mistaken. A mother knows her baby. She knows the feel, the touch, the smell, the bond of love. She knew intimately the infant that had fed upon her breast. Her word was worthless, however, in a public court of law. Everybody knew her place in life. Her claim would be judged by not what happened, but who she was. Tragic people share their tragedies. One mother against another. One prostitute is just like any other. And perhaps she understood all too well the desperation of her adversary, for she would feel the same anguished need to claim her self-worth through her child. And maybe she would have done the very same thing had the tables been turned. Such a horrible loss. Such pure, innocent life, now tarnished, now blemished, permanently shamed by the sordid world of lust and greed and need and desire. How could there be justice for the morally depraved? This child was her life, and now she was lost. Well, the wisdom of Solomon, of course, is why we still read this story. What he made of it sort of become the gold standard of a discerning mind. He was presented with the absolute desperation of these two mothers. It was a perfect catch-22, without trust or justice. But what did it matter, really, when you think about it? Why did these two women even matter? The nursing child didn't seem to notice whose breast from which he was feeding. He was born into a world of dismal pain. Life is cheap. Life doesn't matter. Either mother is expendable. One mother or the other, who really cares? God only knows. God only knows. Or so it would seem. Solomon's powerful verdict was to cut the living child in half. Can you imagine? Literally splitting the infant down the middle in some sort of absurd, sadistic carnival act of equity. Really. These worthless lives would get what they deserved. To split the child in two would make it clear what God and everybody else thought of these sordid claims. Now, interestingly, this is one of those moments in life where what is fair is not necessarily what is just. Fairness would call for literally splitting the difference. What is just, however, was returning the child to its proper mother. Be fair, and both mothers are equally punished. Be just, and you learn the truth. And wisely, Solomon wasn't seeking to be fair. He chose to be just. His proposal was designed to provoke and reveal whose love for the child was greater than her own personal yearning to covet love. And that's what a mother's genuine love reveals. That's precisely what happened. The true mother bore witness to all of her genuine affection and love by protecting her infant's life from certain death, even though she would sacrifice her right to the child and the claim. Please, my Lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him. It also helped, I think, that the fake mother laid out her position in rather clear, harsh terms. She wanted fairness, not justice. It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it. That's the heartlessness of sorrow and tragedy. What she couldn't have for herself, neither would her rival. The scorched earth nature of resentment and sorrow. But justice would prevail. And Solomon judged wisely here and gave the child back to his rightful mother. And sometimes, friends, wisdom and justice, they don't really need to be chosen. Sometimes it's just enough to allow them to be revealed. You know, it seems that such personal sacrifice for one's children is one of the most meaningful attributes of a good mother. It's what many mothers find themselves doing over and over again throughout the course of their children's lives, often without being truly appreciated for it, or at sometimes even severely criticized and chastened for it by their own. But is it even possible? Is it even possible for human beings to understand and appreciate what love is until they're willing to sacrifice their own needs and desires for another? I mean, personal sacrifice is often what true love is all about. Loving people, do loving things. And maybe in the context of potentially losing her child, this poor woman who sought so desperately to hold on to her child in order to be loved, discovered what love she could find within herself, otherwise hidden in the context of her tragic, painful life. It was discovered not by selfishly coveting the one who would provide an innocent, uncomplicated love to satisfy and service her deficit. It was love that was discovered by her willingness to let go of her greatest possession, revealing a selflessness she came to find within herself for another. And that was genuinely motherly love. And Solomon wisely provided her the opportunity to discover this love for herself. A love that redeemed the value of her own existence and diminished life. And friends, that is what justice and mercy envision and embrace. Hence, I perceive the image of God imprinted right in this story. In the merciful wisdom of Solomon, but also in the redemptive love between a mother and a child. Selfless, sacrificial love reveals the truest extent and potential of both human and divine love. God's love for us is like an intimate, self-giving, dignifying, and nurturing love between a mother and a child. And it is meant to be as evident as it is essential. And such wondrous love is what gives birth to life, and I think delivers life back to its basic innocence. from ancient times to the present, from one generation to another, from cradle to grave, from a mother to a child. What is more redemptive to the human soul than this? May we pray together. Loving, merciful God, wisdom of the wise, we thank you for stories like that reveal not only the nature of human beings at its worst, but also the nature of us at our very best. Love redeems so much in life. And so often love leads us to sacrifice what we would desperately want to hold on to most. But we give up for the benefit of someone else. Those are heroes. We see them in our life and our world all the time. May we see it in our mothers. Or may our children see it in us. Or may we see that and recognize it for what it is in our world. In Jesus' name, amen.